Imagine the sky above Beijing, still black, the city wrapped in silence, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the groan of a cartwheel on cobbled streets. Inside the great walls of the Forbidden City, however, silence is a luxury you are not allowed to keep. You are an imperial concubine, one of dozens, maybe hundreds, and your day begins when night has barely loosened its grip. Sleep in this place is not yours to command. The first intrusion is not gentle. Curtains are ripped open with the kind of force that feels like punishment, flooding your chamber with the grey pre-dawn light. Cold water follows, splashed across your face or dabbed onto your eyelids, and before your mind can fully register that you exist, you hear a whisper right at your ear. "Rise, noble lady." The words are soft, but the tone is urgent, carrying the weight of a schedule that belongs not to you, but to a dynasty. Your maids, young girls chosen precisely because they know how to move quickly and without question, are already at work. One smooths your hair as if it had personally offended the empire. Another begins pressing fine silk robes against your shoulders. Someone dabs your lips with rouge so quickly you nearly choke on the powder. You are a canvas, and their task is to paint you divine before you are even fully awake. Forget alarm clocks. In the Forbidden City, your wake-up call is equal parts battle cry and beauty ritual. You have perhaps 7 seconds to transform from a vulnerable human being into a celestial ornament. Puffy eyes, offensive, a crooked bun, dangerous. Drool on the pillow, treasonous. Each flaw is a weapon for the gossip of eunuchs and the contempt of rivals, and rivals here are plentiful. The emperor is not the reason for this frantic performance. He may not even remember your name. He could be elsewhere in the palace playing board games with his ministers or dictating poetry no one dares to critique. No, the true audience for your transformation is the other women of the harem, your colleagues and your enemies. 50, 100, sometimes more, each one watching, waiting for weakness. To falter in appearance is to give them an opening sharper than any blade. Palace women can smell fragility like sharks scent blood in water. They will notice the dullness of your hair, the faint smudge beneath your eyes, the way your smile takes half a second too long to form. In the Forbidden City, survival begins not with clever words or ambitious schemes, but with the angle of a hairpin and the freshness of your rouge. So you sit rigid as a statue while attendants sculpt you into a deity made of powder and silk. A brush of carmine at your lips, a flick of perfume at your wrists. The perfume is mysterious, sometimes floral, sometimes sharp, sometimes an odd musk that might be powdered deer antler. You don't ask, because asking suggests you care, and caring is weakness. You are supposed to appear above the petty details of your own existence, even while they define your survival. Some women adapt. They learn to sleep sitting upright so their hair does not collapse during the night. Others slip secret bribes to their attendants, begging for a gentler hand, a softer comb, or a kinder splash of water in the morning. But the truth is, no kindness is guaranteed. Your beauty is not yours. It belongs to the palace. Your body is a weapon, but one you do not wield. Yawning is not allowed. That would be peasant behavior uncivilized. Your job is to look as though the dawn itself woke, just to honor you. Messy hair, that would not just invite ridicule. It would risk demotion or worse, reassignment. And reassignment in the palace rarely means opportunity. It means vanishing into some dim embroidery chamber where forgotten women stitch dragons into cloth and are never spoken of again. The stakes of each morning are enormous. A careless maid, a clumsy gesture, a few seconds too long spent yawning, and your rank can slide like sand through fingers. You could be excluded from the day's rituals, barred from the brighter rooms, left with the cold rice and the colder stares of those above you. Here, even exhaustion is dangerous. To look tired is to admit defeat, to risk being erased. Silent survival becomes an art form. Your body is polished, powdered, and perfumed until you resemble a jade figurine. You do not speak, you do not protest, you endure. To protest would suggest that you still imagine yourself a person, not an ornament. And ornaments do not argue. By the time the palace bells ring faintly across the courtyards, summoning the harem into motion, you have been transformed. You are no longer yourself. You are a performance, and the day has not yet even begun. This is what it means to wake as an imperial concubine in the Forbidden City, to rise not from rest but into battle. A battle fought not with swords or soldiers, but with silk powder and the suffocating silence of perfection. And as you glide out of your chamber, lips painted, hair gleaming, heart thundering, you know one thing with absolute certainty: today, as yesterday, survival depends on how well you look like you've never needed to survive at all. Breakfast in the Forbidden City was not breakfast in the way you might imagine. It was not comfort food to ease you into the day, not steaming porridge enjoyed with sleepy chatter, not a chance to feel human before duty resumed. No, in the Emperor's palace, breakfast was another stage, another contest, another chance to rise or fall. The hall was arranged with mathematical precision. Concubines entered, not in the order they arrived, but in the order their rank allowed. High-ranking women, the consorts and the favoured few, sat closest to the windows where the sunlight caught their jewels and the warmth kept their dumplings soft. Lower-ranking women were placed in the shadows near the draughty corners where rice porridge cooled quickly and even honeyed buns tasted stale. Position at the table was not about appetite. It was about hierarchy, and every eye knew it. The food itself on paper was extravagant. Bird's nest, soup, lotus seed paste, steamed buns glistening with honey, delicate fish and fruits carried in from far-off provinces. But none of it was meant to be consumed with real hunger. Eating was performance. You took measured bites, delicate, sparrow-like, never chewing too quickly, never leaning forward too eagerly. To show appetite was to show greed, and greed was unbecoming of a celestial lady. Imagine staring at dumplings warm enough to make your stomach ache with longing, but knowing that to swallow them whole would be social death. Some women mastered the art of eating just enough to stay upright during the endless rituals of the morning, yet never so much as to be accused of indulgence. Others tucked melon seeds into their sleeves, sneaking them later when no eyes were on them, crunching in secret like criminals. And while the food cooled, the real feast began, the feast of words. Breakfast conversation was no less dangerous than walking barefoot on a field of swords. No one ever said what they meant. Compliments were daggers wrapped in silk. "Your hairstyle is so unique today," one woman might murmur, lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Was it admiration, or was it a veiled suggestion that you looked ridiculous? "You seem especially radiant this morning," another might say, which could just as easily mean, "We all know you spent last night with the Emperor and we are all watching you now." Every glance was measured. Every phrase had double meaning. A misplaced comment could spark weeks of gossip, endless whispers carried by eunuchs from chamber to chamber. A wrongly worded compliment could see you demoted, punished, or worse, forgotten. The safest topic, the only truly safe topic, was praise for the Emperor. "His Majesty's poetry is divine," someone would intone, even if everyone in the room privately agreed his verses sounded like the drunken ramblings of a goose. Applause followed, polite, exaggerated, obligatory. Flattery was the only music allowed at the breakfast table, and the Emperor's absence did not mean his shadow wasn't there. He was always present, always listening through his invisible network of ears. And so the hall filled not with laughter but with tension, a silence heavy with the clinking of porcelain, the faint rustle of silk sleeves, and the brittle notes of forced compliments. No one dared slurp their soup. No one dared burp, even politely. A misplaced sound could echo in memory longer than a misplaced word. Chopsticks were held delicately, as though the women's very dignity balanced upon them. Breakfast was not nourishment. It was battle, a battle fought with glances, whispers, and the careful choreography of porcelain bowls. You weren't simply eating, you were auditioning. For favour, for survival, for the right to see another dawn in the gilded prison of the Forbidden City. By the time the meal ended, stomachs were still half empty, but the women were exhausted as though they had marched through war. A few had secured subtle victories, a rival unsettled by a well-placed phrase, a eunuch carrying away a compliment designed to be overheard. Others had lost ground, their silence mistaken for weakness, their nervous laughter catalogued as guilt. And when the servants began to clear away the bowls, you knew this was only the first trial of the day. Breakfast had been survived. Barely. But survival here is never permanent. It only buys you time until the next contest. And that next contest begins the moment you rise from the table and step into the sunlight where eyes are already watching for your next mistake. After breakfast, the women of the Forbidden City did not retreat into privacy. Privacy was a luxury few could afford here. Instead, the morning flowed into its next ritual, one so subtle it could almost seem trivial to the untrained eye, but within the palace it was as crucial as breathing. It was called simply being seen. In the outer world, people walked with purpose. Farmers hurried to fields, merchants bustled to shops, soldiers marched in formation. In the palace, purpose was a liability. You did not stomp across the courtyards like a peasant late for cabbage duty. You glided, slowly, deliberately, as though each step were part of a dance choreographed centuries before you were born. Your robes trailed behind you, 3, sometimes 4 layers of embroidered silk sweeping across stone paths like the world's most extravagant dust mop. Each step was calculated, each angle rehearsed. The goal was not efficiency but spectacle, to be seen by just the right eyes at just the right moment. And who was watching everyone? Eunuchs with sharp memories and sharper tongues, maids eager to curry favor with higher mistresses, other concubines whose gazes could slice like knives if you let them linger too long. But most of all, the unseen eyes of power, those who carried whispers back to the empress, or worse, to the emperor himself. The trick of being seen was balance. Too relaxed and you appeared lazy. Too stiff and you seemed desperate. You had to walk the line of effortless threat as though you had no need for attention even while you hungered for it. Every flick of your fan, every tilt of your head was part of a silent performance. Accessories mattered. A jade hairpin catching the sunlight just so could blind a lower-ranked rival for an instant, a gesture as satisfying as any spoken insult. Slippers embroidered with gold thread, technically reserved for women of higher status, might accidentally appear on your feet if you thought no one would notice. But of course someone always noticed. The palace thrived on noticing. The only question was whether they would report it or let you enjoy your small rebellion for a price. Compliments could be planted along the way, as carefully tended as seeds in a garden. If a noble lady admired your robe in the presence of a chatty eunuch, that praise would flutter through corridors like a butterfly and land directly in the ears of the empress before you reached the koi pond. Praise was never wasted in the Forbidden City. It was currency. Yet every move carried danger. Smile too widely and you were a flirt. Smile too little and you were plotting something. Speak with too much energy and you seemed ambitious. Speak with too little and you risked invisibility. And invisibility was worse than ridicule. An invisible concubine did not get promoted. She did not receive gifts. She did not get chosen. She was reassigned quietly to embroidery chambers or shadowed rooms, her name fading from conversation until she ceased to exist at all. You learned to perfect the art of looking accidentally radiant. A relaxed stroll through the peony gardens timed just as the emperor passed by. A slow turn of the head so that your jade earrings glittered in the morning light. A faint sigh performed near enough to a rival to suggest melancholy without ever revealing the real cause. Every gesture was loaded. Every look was deliberate. Spies added another layer of peril. They were not the assassins of storybooks, but far more dangerous silken-shoed informers, sipping tea, arching eyebrows, noting every small detail. A nervous laugh, a restless hand, a moment's hesitation, these were their weapons. They could whisper you into disgrace by evening. And so you moved through the courtyards like a phantom of silk and powder, gliding, smiling, never stumbling, never rushing. A single misstep could haunt you for weeks. But if you struck the balance, if you looked just busy enough, just radiant enough, just humble enough, you secured another layer of survival. Being seen in the Forbidden City was not about visibility. It was about existence. To be seen correctly was to stay alive. To be unseen was to vanish quietly, permanently into the embroidery rooms from which no one ever returned. If breakfast was a battle and walking the courtyards was theatre, then the true weapon of survival in the Forbidden City was not a jeweled hairpin or a silk robe, it was your tongue. Not for argument, not for honesty, but for flattery. Truth had little place in the palace. Truth was for scholars and dusty scrolls for Confucian philosophers debating morality in libraries. For you, a concubine, truth was dangerous. It was blunt. It was heavy. It was unwelcome. What mattered was performance. And in this palace, performance was life. Flattery was not as simple as saying, "You look handsome today, Your Majesty." That would have been as worthless as handing in a blank scroll during an imperial exam. No flattery required imagination, poetry, and precision. The emperor had to be made to believe not only that you admired him, but that your admiration revealed something eternal, something celestial. Your presence today is like the first plum blossoms after winter, you might say, bowing your head just enough to seem humbled by his radiance. Or the brush of your calligraphy is the sound of rivers obeying heaven's will. Did it matter that his handwriting looked like a drunk goose had stumbled across parchment? Not at all. What mattered was that you spoke as if he had summoned the stars themselves. But you did not flatter only the emperor. You flattered the empress, the eunuchs, even your rivals. A compliment to Lady Chen's embroidery delivered in the right tone could unravel her for weeks as she tried to decipher whether you meant it or whether you mocked her clumsy stitches. That uncertainty was part of the game. Sometimes poison was not in the tea. It was in the words. The eunuchs were a particularly important audience. They might not sit on the throne, but their whispers travelled faster than any imperial decree. Tell one that he looked younger than yesterday, or that his loyalty to the Son of Heaven shone brighter than jade, and he might remember your name the next time he prepared the evening selection scroll. In the Forbidden City, a eunuch's memory was worth more than gold. Yet flattery was a double-edged fan. Too little, and you seemed cold, aloof, ungrateful. Too much, and you risked looking false, insincere. The sweet spot was delicate admiration laced with wonder, offered with the casual grace of someone who just happened to notice divinity. There were even lessons in this art. Older concubines passed down techniques like sacred knowledge, how to widen your eyes at the right moment, how to sigh just deeply enough when the emperor read his dreadful poetry, how to flutter your fan in rhythm with his words as though your very heart beat in time with his. These gestures, subtle as falling leaves, were rehearsed endlessly. A single well-timed "Oh, Your Majesty" could elevate you 2 invisible steps higher in rank without anyone openly acknowledging it. And then there were rehearsals. When the emperor was absent, the women still praised him. They flattered the walls, the gardens, the goldfish in the pond as if he were listening through every corner of the palace. Because sometimes he was, and even if he wasn't, it was good practice. The danger, of course, was sincerity. The palace had no room for it. To speak honestly about the emperor's mediocrity or the empress's sharp temper or a rival's ridiculous hairstyle was to sign your own exile. Sincerity was weakness. Performance was survival. So you learned to lace your words with honey, to cloak your true thoughts beneath layers of poetic admiration, to make flattery sound less like strategy and more like worship. It wasn't about lying. It was about creating a version of reality so beautiful, so alluring that even the emperor chose to believe it. In the palace, sincerity was optional. But flattery was law. After the morning trials of appearance, breakfast and flattery, the concubines retreated into what were politely called hobbies. To outsiders this might have sounded pleasant, an afternoon of art, reading, music, embroidery. But inside the Forbidden City, hobbies were not leisure. They were control. They were the carefully measured distractions of women who could not leave, could not choose, and could not stop performing even for themselves. Embroidery was the most common. Imagine sitting for hours on a lacquered stool hunched over a sheet of silk that shimmered under the light of the courtyard. Each stitch was as small as a grain of rice, each thread chosen with the precision of a general placing soldiers on a battlefield. Dragons, phoenixes, chrysanthemums, lotuses, the designs were not arbitrary. A single motif could speak volumes. A phoenix rising might suggest renewal, perhaps a veiled declaration that you were rising in favor. A withering lotus might hint at the decline of a rival. To drop a stitch was more than a mistake. It could be interpreted as symbolic, your loyalty unraveling your concentration, waning your heart elsewhere. A rival could seize upon such a flaw and whisper it into an accusation. Calligraphy was another of these required accomplishments. But again, it was not simply about neat handwriting, it was performance disguised as culture. The brush strokes had to glide with delicate authority, neither too timid nor too bold. Women often composed poems about flowers or the seasons, but beneath the gentle imagery they slipped sharp commentary. A verse about a fading chrysanthemum might be a subtle strike at an aging consort. A poem about spring returning could be a hint of one's own renewal. The paper was soft, the ink black and smooth, but the words were weapons. Music filled the air as well. The guqin, the zither, the pipa, each note plucked like a raindrop falling into a pond. The melodies were meant to sound wistful, longing, ethereal. Too cheerful, and someone might accuse you of being suspiciously content in a world where contentment was not expected. Too mournful, and you risked looking defeated. The safest music was the melancholy of longing, the sound of missing someone you hadn't seen in months, even if that someone was the emperor who could not recall the curve of your smile. Reading was permitted but heavily controlled. Confucian classics, moral parables, tales of virtuous women who obeyed their husbands and met dignified deaths. No love stories, no political theory, nothing that could ignite rebellion or independent thought. These texts were meant to mold women into examples of submission, to remind them that their highest purpose was loyalty, silence, and sacrifice. And so concubines read dutifully, their eyes gliding over the pages while their minds wandered elsewhere, sometimes into dreams of freedom, sometimes into strategies for the next subtle strike against a rival. Some women managed to twist these hobbies into performances of power. A concubine might embroider an exquisite robe for the emperor and have it presented in front of the entire court. Another might play the guqin in the gardens where she knew spies would hear and report that she strummed as though longing for his majesty. Hobbies became currency. They were signals, gestures, declarations wrapped in the delicate silk of culture. But for most, these tasks were not empowerment. They were survival in disguise. Hour after hour of stitching, brushing, strumming until your fingers cramped, your back ached, your eyes burned. It was better than idleness because idleness was dangerous. A woman with too much free time might gossip unwisely, brood too openly, or even plot. The palace could not risk that. So hobbies filled the hours, giving the appearance of refinement, while quietly tightening the net of control. The truth was simple: you were not creating, you were waiting. Each embroidered phoenix, each practiced scale, each copied passage from the Analects was a way of killing time, politely, gracefully, under the watchful eye of a dynasty that demanded you never look idle, never look restless, never look human. And so the courtyards of the Forbidden City filled with the soft sounds of culture, the click of needles, the scrape of brushes, the pluck of strings, beautiful, tranquil, dignified, and beneath it all suffocating. Every empire has a sun, and every sun casts a shadow. In the Forbidden City, that shadow was the Empress. She was not simply the wife of the emperor. She was the axis around which every concubine's fate revolved. To the outside world, the Empress was the embodiment of virtue. She was called the mother of the nation, the woman whose conduct was to serve as a model for millions of wives across the empire. Her face appeared in painted scrolls, her name was sung in ancestral rites, her every gesture scrutinized by courtiers and officials who hoped to glimpse in her movements the harmony of heaven itself. Inside the palace, however, the Empress was far less ethereal. She was flesh and blood, ambition and fear steel wrapped in silk. For the concubines, she was gatekeeper and executioner, protector and rival. Her authority was subtle but absolute. She oversaw the daily schedules of the harem, the rules of appearance, the allocation of servants. She determined which concubines received, which silks, which chambers, which attendants. A word from her could delay your delivery of food by hours, leaving you faint and humiliated. Another word could have the eunuchs bring you medicinal herbs. You did not request an act of kindness, or perhaps a warning depending on the timing. And above all, the empress controlled access. The emperor might decide whom he wished to see, but it was the empress who arranged the lists, who approved the evenings, who gave permission for concubines to be summoned. Without her blessing, your beauty, your flattery, your carefully practiced arts were meaningless. You were an actress locked outside the theatre rehearsing lines for a play you would never perform. The empress herself was rarely young. She was usually chosen for her lineage, her connections, her family's loyalty to the throne. She might not have been the emperor's first love or even his favorite, but she carried the weight of dynasties on her shoulders. Her father's military rank, her uncle's bureaucratic influence, her clan's power across provinces, all these things made her untouchable. A single concubine could not topple her. Even the emperor himself had to tread carefully when it came to her. For you, this meant an endless balancing act. You had to bow lower to her than to the emperor, but not so low as to appear mocking. You had to flatter her, but not so sweetly that she suspected manipulation. You had to obey her, but also hint at your own worth just enough that she might see you as useful rather than threatening. Some concubines tried to ingratiate themselves with her, becoming loyal attendants, echoing her words, praising her taste in poetry or embroidery. Others tried to undermine her, subtly whispering in the emperor's ear about her sharp tongue, her jealousy, her failure to bear sons. Both paths were perilous. To please the empress, too much risked being seen as her pawn. To displease her was suicide. Even when you were far from her gaze, her presence lingered. Servants carried her words like messengers of doom. If she raised an eyebrow at your robe in the morning, the story would spread by evening Lady So-and-so wore colours unfitting her station. If she looked too long at your embroidery, you would not sleep that night, wondering whether she admired it or whether she intended to use it against you. The shadow of the empress was long and it was cold. No matter how brightly the emperor's favour shone, that shadow was always there, ready to swallow you the moment you stumbled. And so you learned a new performance, one not of beauty or flattery, but of survival beneath the empress's gaze. If the empress was the shadow over your days, then the concubines around you were the shifting mirrors reflecting light one moment, turning into knives the next. Rivalry was the air you breathed. It was not always loud, not always visible. Rarely did it take the form of shouting or open insult. Instead, it was a soft war waged in whispers, glances, silences. A rival might greet you with a smile that lingered too long, just enough to suggest pity. She might gift you a length of silk dyed in an unlucky colour. She might compliment your singing voice in front of the emperor, but in a tone that suggested you had been practicing too hard, too desperate. Friendship, too, was a weapon. Women allied with one another shared secrets, made pacts only to turn those very confidences into daggers when the balance of favour shifted. A single careless confession, a single sigh too heavy, could resurface weeks later in the emperor's ear, twisted and sharpened. She seemed troubled, a rival might murmur. Perhaps her loyalty wavers. Perhaps her mind is not steady. The competition was not only for the emperor's affection, but for survival itself. Favour meant resources, better chambers, finer clothes, healthier food. It meant more attendants, more opportunities to be seen, more safety from accusations. Without favour, you sank into invisibility. And invisibility in the Forbidden City was not peace. It was a slow death by irrelevance, where your name fell from the servants' lips and eventually from the emperor's memory. The most dangerous rivalries flared around children. A concubine who bore a son could rise higher than any beauty or wit alone could take her. A son was a claim to the future, a stake in the dynasty. And so infants became targets. Rumours of poisoned milk of cradles tipped in the night of mysterious fevers, these tales drifted through the harem like smoke. Official records speak delicately of illnesses or unfortunate accidents, but behind closed doors every mother slept with one eye open. Even small gestures could tip the balance. To sit too close to the emperor at a banquet was bold. To sit too far was weak. To laugh at his joke too quickly marked you as shallow. To delay your laughter marked you as cold. Every woman in the room studied not only the emperor but also each other, mapping alliances and vulnerabilities with the precision of generals plotting campaigns. And yet in the midst of rivalry there was also a peculiar intimacy. You shared the same prison, the same gilded cage. Sometimes in the soft hours of the night, when lantern light flickered and the palace grew hushed, a rival might sit beside you and whisper stories from her childhood, her mother's cooking, the hills of her province, the scent of rain on her village roads. In those moments for a heartbeat you remembered you were both human. But by dawn that same woman might place a poisonous word against you, trading your trust for her survival. Friendship was never free. It was always conditional, always weighed, always dangerous. And yet without it the days were unbearable. Better to risk betrayal than to sit in silence, utterly alone with only the echo of your thoughts. So the Forbidden City was not just a palace, it was a chessboard, and every concubine was both player and piece. Some advanced boldly, some defended quietly, some were sacrificed early. And you never knew whether you were the queen, the pawn, or already a piece about to be swept from the board. Night in the Forbidden City was not silence, it was its own theatre. When the last rays of sunlight bled from the palace walls, lanterns flared to life. They cast long, trembling shadows across the lacquered beams, made the gold dragons seem to flicker as though alive. From your chamber you could hear the creak of gates closing, the shuffle of eunuchs changing posts, the faint ripple of silk as attendants moved swiftly through corridors with trays of food scrolls or incense. This was the hour of waiting. For most of the day you performed as if every glance might decide your future. But at night the decision lay beyond your hands. Would you be summoned? Would your name be whispered by the eunuchs who carried the emperor's decree? Or would you remain behind, dressing and undressing in silence, your heart heavy with the sound of other doors opening? The ritual was precise. Eunuchs carried tablets inscribed with the names of concubines. The emperor would select, sometimes at random, sometimes by whim, sometimes with intention only he understood. The chosen name was then delivered, carried down torchlit halls with a formality that felt both sacred and cruel. If your name was spoken, attendants rushed in at once. You were bathed, perfumed, dressed in robes carefully chosen not to overshadow the emperor's own attire. Your hair was reset, your jewels inspected for flaws. There was no time to prepare yourself emotionally. Excitement, fear, anxiety, whatever you felt, you swallowed it whole. To hesitate was to falter. If your name was not spoken, you were left to your chamber. You could hear the sounds of preparation from elsewhere, the splash of water, the murmur of attendants, the muffled shuffle of a concubine being led through the palace. Some women prayed in these moments, whispering to gods and ancestors. Others clenched their teeth and feigned indifference, though their hands shook as they unpinned their hair. And then there were the cruelest nights, the ones where your name had not been called for weeks, months, even years. Nights when your reflection in polished bronze no longer seemed young, when the silks you wore began to feel like a costume for a role that had ended. Those nights stretched long, filled with the sound of laughter echoing from distant chambers. For the chosen, the walk itself was part of the ceremony. Barefoot, carried sometimes on the eunuch's shoulders to symbolize purity, the concubine would be borne across polished floors to the emperor's quarters. Candles glowed along the way, casting her face in light that felt both sacred and exposing. Inside, the emperor awaited. He might be weary, distracted, consumed by affairs of state, or he might be warm, affectionate, eager for companionship. You never knew. What you did know was that this was your moment, not just for affection but for survival. A word whispered here, a smile caught in the lamplight, could raise you higher than months of waiting. And so nightfall became the most dangerous hour, not because of darkness but because of possibility. In every shadowed chamber women waited with hope, fear and despair, and in every torchlit corridor a eunuch's footsteps carried the weight of fate. The summons was never just a call to the emperor's bed. It was a call to gamble your future against the whims of the most powerful man in the empire. To live in the Forbidden City was to study the art of survival, not merely to exist, but to maneuver, to anticipate, to endure. Every glance became information. A lowered eyelid might mean disfavor. A smile held a second too long might mean an alliance was being offered or a trap was being set. Even silence spoke louder than words. You learned to read people the way scholars read texts, searching for the smallest details that might shift the story. Survival was not strength in the ordinary sense. You could not raise your voice, could not lift a sword, could not run. Instead, it was patience sharpened to a blade. It was knowing when to step forward and when to bow back into the shadows. Food was both nourishment and risk. Every dish brought to your chamber was tasted by servants, but even then suspicion lingered. A bitter note in the broth, a faint cloudiness in the wine, it was enough to make your heart pound. Rumors of poison floated constantly, though rarely confirmed. Women sometimes refused to eat their fear greater than their hunger until they wasted into frailty. Others trusted too easily and paid the price with sudden fevers that never passed. Words, too, could kill. A single phrase uttered in carelessness could unravel everything. If you praised your family too openly, rivals might accuse them of ambition. If you laughed too freely with a eunuch, whispers of impropriety would follow. Even your talents were double-edged. To sing too beautifully might please the emperor, but it might also spark jealousy among those who envied your skill. And yet you had to perform. You had to remain graceful, polished, radiant, because invisibility was death of another kind. The emperor must notice you, remember you, favor you, or else your days would fade into the endless repetition of waiting. For some, survival meant humility. They bowed deeply, spoke softly, and made themselves small, hoping to pass beneath the notice of enemies. For others, survival meant ambition. They formed alliances, offered gifts, whispered carefully chosen truths that edged their rivals into suspicion. And for a few rare women, survival meant boldness, meeting the emperor's gaze with steady eyes, daring to remind him they were more than shadows. But the truth was harsh. No art of survival guaranteed safety. You could be clever, cautious, loyal, and still fall. You could be ambitious and still be betrayed. The game was rigged from the start, the rules written by those above you, and changed without warning. And so the concubine's art was not truly about winning. It was about lasting. Day by day, breath by breath, step by step, through polished corridors where your reflection looked back at you and asked, how much longer? Because in the Forbidden City, survival was not a single act. It was a lifetime of small choices, all weighed against, a silence that grew heavier with each passing year. For all the silks and jewels, for all the elaborate rituals of bows and summons, the true measure of a concubine's fortune was not beauty or wit, it was children. In the Forbidden City, the birth of a son was the closest thing to immortality. To bear a child for the emperor was to carve your name into the stone of dynasty. Yet this greatest honor was also the most perilous gamble a woman could make. Pregnancy was guarded like a treasure, but also shadowed by fear. From the moment you felt the faint flutter within your chamber became both sanctuary and prison. Food was triple-checked, herbs measured with trembling care. Attendants hovered constantly, listening for your breath in the night. Every step you took was watched, every movement weighed against risk. Because enemies were never far. A child born of another concubine threatened everyone else's place. Rumors whispered of miscarriages that came too suddenly, of herbs slipped into teas, of unseen hands pushing too hard on an elbow or shoulder. Some women never left their chambers during those months, preferring isolation to chance. And yet, even in safety, fate was cruel. The palace was filled with the sound of mourning for infants who lived only days, for daughters born, where sons were expected for fragile heirs whose breath faltered before their names could be written into the records. Still, a surviving child changed everything. A concubine who bore a son rose higher than jewels or titles could ever lift her. Her enemies might gnash their teeth, but she became untouchable, guarded by the shadow of the boy who might one day sit upon the throne. Her rivals bowed, her attendants multiplied, her words carried weight in matters far beyond her chamber. For those without children, life was sharper, more precarious. Every month that passed without news brought a little more fear, a little more fading of favor. Some prayed endlessly to temple gods, burning incense until their eyes stung with smoke. Others sought secret remedies from trusted eunuchs, powders and draughts that promised fertility. But many watched helplessly as years slipped by, their beauty unchanged, yet their future dimming. The bond between mother and child was fierce, but it was never simple. A son was raised not by his mother, but by officials, tutors, wet nurses. Even the highest-ranking concubine saw her own child only in brief supervised visits. She lived in constant dread that her rivals would find ways to weaken him, or that the emperor himself might withdraw favor and leave the boy vulnerable. And for daughters there was pride but also sorrow. They were married away, bartered into alliances, gone from their mother's sight almost as soon as they could speak. A daughter's birth might save a concubine from obscurity, but it rarely secured her future. In this way, children were both salvation and sorrow. To bear one was to rise, but to lose one was to shatter. And always behind every lullaby whispered through silk curtains was the unspoken knowledge that the child was never fully yours. The palace belonged to the emperor, and so did the lives born within it. The palace revolved around one man. Every step, every smile, every sigh of the emperor carried the weight of storms. When he looked at you, the world seemed to sharpen. The chamber-hushed attendants froze, and your own heartbeat thudded loud enough to drown the silence. His gaze could warm like spring sun or burn like fire. It could lift you higher than titles or reduce you to dust without a word spoken. And yet for all his power he was still a man, fickle, weary, distracted. The empire's burdens weighed on him, the endless scrolls of reports, the councils filled with quarrels, the battles at distant borders. When he turned toward the women of his inner court, he sought escape. Sometimes laughter, sometimes tenderness, sometimes simply the comfort of not being emperor for a few brief hours. But to the concubines, his gaze was destiny. If it lingered upon you during a banquet, rivals stiffened with dread. If he passed you by without notice, attendants whispered that your days of favor were waning. The tilt of his head, the twitch of his lips, even the smallest pause of his eyes across the room, all of it was read, measured, and dissected like scripture. There were those who mastered the art of catching that gaze. They moved with grace, spoke in tones carefully pitched, dressed in colors that flattered both themselves and his mood. They knew when to laugh at his jokes and when to lower their eyes in soft silence. They understood the delicate balance between pleasing him and never appearing too eager. But favor was not always earned. Sometimes it fell suddenly like lightning. A word spoken in passing, a memory of a song, a resemblance to a long-forgotten face. It could be enough to draw the emperor's attention. And once caught, it was both a blessing and a curse. Because the emperor's gaze was never yours to keep. It shifted like wind over water, impossible to pin down. One night you might be called to his chamber, your name carried on golden breath. The next weeks might pass in silence, your offerings ignored, your heart sinking as his footsteps echoed past your door. And yet even absence was dangerous. To lose his gaze entirely was to fade into shadows, to become one of the many whose names blurred together, remembered only when lists of concubines were recited during rituals. For some, this obscurity was mercy. For others, it was a slow death of the spirit. And so the emperor's gaze was the most precious, most fleeting treasure of the forbidden city, desired by all, feared by all. For in its warmth you could bloom, and in its absence you could wither. The palace was not only a sanctuary of silk and ceremony, it was a battlefield. Unlike the fields where soldiers clashed with steel, this war was fought in silence, in glances and gestures, in words carefully placed like daggers behind fans. The concubines were both comrades and enemies, bound together by duty to the emperor, yet divided by the hunger for survival and favor. Rivalries sprouted from the smallest seed. A sleeve too bright at a banquet, a laugh held a moment too long in the emperor's presence, a rumor of a pregnancy whispered down a corridor. Each gesture could ripple into suspicion, jealousy, and vengeance. Some rivalries were open, carried in the stiff bows exchanged across polished floors. Others were veiled, hidden in courtesies that dripped with poison. A compliment too sweet a gift that arrived with suspicious timing, a note sent under the cover of friendship. In these games, sincerity was dangerous. Every kindness might conceal a trap. Yet in the shifting sands of power, alliances were also essential. No concubine survived alone. Sisters by rank often bound themselves together, protecting one another against stronger rivals. Attendants, though lowly, were recruited into quiet networks of spies, their ears pressed to doors, their eyes sharp in the shadows. Even eunuchs became allies or foes, their loyalty bought with coin affection or promises of influence. There were alliances forged of desperation, two women united only until fortune tilted, and others that endured built on shared fear or genuine affection, rare as spring water. Some whispered of bonds that ran deeper than survival, secret friendships that softened the cruel edges of court life, though to trust too deeply was always perilous. And so day by day the palace pulsed with quiet war. Teacups shattered not by accident, silks torn with hidden hands, cosmetics tampered with to ruin a face just before a banquet. Words found their way into the emperor's ear, small doubts planted to erode favor. But every rival risked the same fate. A misstep could turn the tide, and the woman who schemed too boldly might find herself cast aside, her attendants stripped away, her name reduced to a cautionary whisper. In this world, alliances and rivalries were not choices, they were lifelines. To refuse them was to drown alone. To wield them carelessly was to be dragged under in their undertow. And so the concubines learned to smile with enemies, to sleep beside daggers, to trust just enough to survive another day. For within those crimson walls even friendship was a weapon, and every bond carried its price. They walked silently through the corridors, their steps soft against the stone, their eyes lowered, yet ever watchful. The eunuchs were shadows of the palace, neither fully men nor entirely servants, but something else, keepers of secrets, carriers of whispers, the living threads that bound the forbidden city together. To outsiders they seemed pitiable, mutilated for service, condemned to lives of obedience. But within the palace walls their role was far more complicated. They were gatekeepers of chambers, guardians of doors, voices that called or denied the names of concubines to the emperor's ear. They controlled the flow of food, of gifts, of letters. Nothing passed untouched by their hands, and so whispers clung to them like incense. A eunuch knew which concubine had been summoned last night, which attendants wept behind closed doors, which noble family had sent offerings too generous to be innocent. Their ears were tuned to the sigh of silks in the dark, to the scrape of sandals in the snow, to the half-breathed quarrels that drifted through paper screens. For the concubines, eunuchs were both lifeline and danger. A trusted eunuch could smooth the path to the emperor's chambers, carrying a poem or gift at just the right hour. He could whisper a kind word at a council, or make sure that a rival's letter never reached its destination. But to anger one was to risk slow ruin meals, delayed cosmetics, spoiled messages twisted into slander before they reached imperial ears. The eunuchs themselves were bound in rivalries too. Their ranks were tangled in hierarchies as strict as those of the concubines. Senior eunuchs commanded wings of the palace, their influence stretching like invisible nets. Some were loyal, others ambitious, all dangerous in ways that required careful study. And behind their service lay resentment. They had given their bodies to the empire, stripped of lineage, family, and heirs. Their only power lay in service, in weaving webs of secrets, in bending the palace's endless hunger for knowledge to their advantage. So they whispered. In corners, in courtyards, in gardens where koi stirred the water. They whispered to one another, to attendants, to concubines, desperate enough to pay in jewels or favors. They whispered truths and half-truths alike, weaving stories that blurred into the fabric of palace life. To listen to those whispers was to grasp the veins of the forbidden city itself. For behind the emperor's throne, behind the lacquered doors and perfumed chambers, it was the eunuchs who knew everything. And in a world where knowledge was survival, their whispers could crown you or destroy you. The palace dazzled with gold and silk, but beneath its beauty lay a constant gnawing terror. Every concubine lived with the shadow of punishment hovering like a hawk above a trembling sparrow. One wrong glance, one careless phrase, one whisper carried by the wrong set of ears, and a life could unravel in an instant. The punishments varied, and each carried its own form of dread. The mildest was banishment to the cold palace, a wing of forgotten chambers where disfavored concubines were abandoned. There the silks turned to rags, attendants vanished, and the air itself seemed to grow colder, as if the walls absorbed despair. Some women lived out years in that frozen silence, their beauty fading, their names erased, their stories ending in solitude. Others met harsher fates. A concubine accused of betrayal or witchcraft might vanish overnight, her chambers sealed, her belongings burned. Some whispered of poison hidden in tea of silk soaked with slow venom of pills, offered as mercy but given as sentence. The palace never spoke of such endings aloud, but the concubines knew. They felt it in the sudden emptiness of a chamber, in the way a eunuch avoided a certain name. Fear was the emperor's invisible chain. It needed no daily tightening. It simply lingered heavy and undeniable. The women learned to guard every word, to smile when they longed to cry, to bow even when rage coiled in their chests. The weight of punishment did not merely shape their actions, it carved itself into their souls. Even the attendants lived in its shadow. A careless servant might be whipped, dismissed, or worse, dragged into punishments meant as examples. Eunuchs, too, bore scars of loyalty questioned or errors magnified. The forbidden city allowed no room for mistake, and so every hand trembled with caution. Yet the cruelest punishment was perhaps the simplest, being forgotten. To be unseen by the emperor, to be passed over night after night, was to wither alive. A concubine who lost favor became invisible, her chambers dimming, her name dissolving from the lips of courtiers. In that silence many broke faster than those who met more violent ends. And so the concubines lived not only for favor but against fear. They danced on a blade's edge, weaving smiles, while the shadow of punishment stretched long behind them. Every step was careful, every gesture rehearsed, for one misstep could send them tumbling into exile, into ruin, or into a silence that no one dared to break. Even in a place woven with shadows, the forbidden city sometimes glittered with moments of breathtaking beauty. Festivals transformed the palace, pulling every concubine, every attendant, every eunuch into the rhythm of celebration. These days offered not only diversion but also a dangerous stage on which the theatre of favor and rivalry played its grandest scenes. When the Lantern Festival arrived, the courtyards filled with light. Silken lanterns painted with dragons, phoenixes and blossoms floated above the palace walls like drifting stars. Concubines would walk through the gardens in robes of silver and vermilion, their faces bathed in the glow of 1,000 flickering flames. For one night, the sharp edges of rivalry softened into shared wonder as women gazed at the glowing skies and felt, if only briefly, that they were part of something beyond themselves. The Mid-Autumn Festival was another moment of enchantment. Mooncakes carved with intricate patterns were offered on lacquered trays. Poets recited verses to the round-watching moon, while musicians plucked zithers under bowers of night-blooming jasmine. The concubines would smile and laugh, their hair jeweled with ornaments that caught the moonlight like drops of water. But beneath those smiles lingered the same old hunger. Who would the emperor glance at in that soft glow? Whose presence would he honor with a word, a smile, or a sip from the same cup of wine? Even the new year filled the palace with illusions of joy. Red banners fluttered across the gates, firecrackers cracked in rapid bursts, and drums rolled like thunder. Concubines prepared dances and songs, their silks swirling as if the very air had become alive. Eunuchs bustled with offerings, the air thick with incense and roasted meats. For a few days the palace seemed to thrum with life, its walls alive with sound and color. But every festival was also a performance of power. The emperor watched from his throne, his eyes weighing each gesture, each glance. Concubines fought to catch the briefest flicker of his gaze. A well-timed dance, a perfectly chosen robe, a poem recited with grace, these could shift the delicate scales of favor. Behind the laughter and song, the rivalries deepened sharper than ever. And when the lanterns dimmed, when the fireworks faded into smoke, the palace returned to its endless hush of suspicion and longing. The festivals were illusions, bright masks laid over the ceaseless struggles of survival. Yet for the concubines, those fleeting nights of brilliance mattered. They were reminders that even in a world of silence and shadows, beauty could still blaze like fire across the darkness, if only for a little while. Stop. Shall I move forward with Part 16, Dreams of Freedom, where we step into the private hopes of the concubines, the secret longings for life beyond the crimson walls, the memories of families left behind, and the impossible dreams of escape. When the lanterns were put away and the music faded, the concubines returned to their chambers carrying more than just jewels or silks. They carried memories of what might have been dreams that fluttered like moths in the darkness of their solitude. For behind the carefully painted smiles and elaborate rituals, each woman bore within her heart a quiet ache, the longing for freedom. At night, when the eunuchs had withdrawn and the halls grew, still some would sit by their narrow windows, gazing at the distant line of roofs, silhouetted against the stars. They imagined the world beyond the crimson walls, streets alive with merchants, children chasing one another through alleys, farmers tilling the soil under an open sky. A simple home, a husband chosen by affection rather than decree, the sound of laughter not bound by etiquette. Such dreams were both sweet and cruel, for they reminded them of what they could never touch again. Some clung to memories of their families, a mother's face, a father's voice, the warmth of siblings. These recollections softened over time, becoming hazy as mist. The palace devoured identity, turning daughters into shadows of rank and title. To remember too sharply was to suffer, and so many let their memories blur until they belonged more to dreams than to waking life. Others dreamed of escape, though they knew the futility. Stories whispered of concubines who had slipped past the gates disguised as servants, or who had bribed eunuchs to carry letters home. None of those tales ended well. Some were dragged back in chains, others simply vanished, their fates sealed in silence. Yet even knowing the risk, the fantasy of flight lingered like a bird beating its wings against a gilded cage. The emperor himself was both their captor and their hope, for if he smiled upon them, their lives blossomed with privilege. Yet his favor was not freedom, it was another kind of prison, gilded more brightly but no less confining. A favored concubine lived in constant vigilance, guarding every word, every step, lest fortune shift and cast her into oblivion. And still the dreams persisted. Some women poured their longings into poetry, writing verses that circled around the themes of wind rivers and distant mountains. Others stitched their desires into embroidery, the patterns of cranes or flowing water carrying meanings that only they knew. In these secret acts they wove small rebellions, fragments of the selves they had lost. The palace was vast, but the human spirit was vaster still. No wall, however high, could fully cage a woman's dreams. Though their bodies were bound within the forbidden city, their thoughts wandered across plains and rivers, touching freedoms they would never hold but always yearn for. Stop. Shall I continue with Part 17? The eunuch's world, shifting perspective to those who served closest to the concubines, the eunuchs who held power yet lived lives shaped by sacrifice and silence. To understand the concubines' world fully, you must also see it through the eyes of those who served them most intimately, the eunuchs. They were everywhere, gliding silently through corridors, carrying messages, arranging audiences, preparing meals, even guarding the gates of the inner court. Their presence was constant, yet they were both indispensable and despised, wielding influence but forever marked by sacrifice. Every eunuch bore the same wound, the price of entry into the palace. To serve within the forbidden city required surrendering one's future as a man, as a father, as a husband. For some, it was a desperate choice driven by poverty and the hope of steady food and shelter. For others, it was forced upon them in childhood, a decision made by parents who sought favor with the throne. Whatever the path, it was irreversible. Their identities became fused with service, their bodies reminders of what had been lost. Yet within the palace, eunuchs held power that few outside could imagine. They were the intermediaries between the emperor and his women, carrying whispers, letters, and gifts. A single word from a trusted eunuch could determine which concubine received the honor of a summons and which was left to wait in obscurity. This made them both feared and courted, their loyalties bought with bribes, promises, or quiet flattery. Still, their lives were far from easy. To the concubines, they were often confidants, keepers of secrets that could never be shared elsewhere. A eunuch might know the hidden tears of a young concubine, the words she dared not speak aloud, the schemes she nurtured in her heart. Yet that knowledge was also a burden, for to misstep to align with the wrong woman at the wrong time could mean exile or death. They lived in a world of contradictions. Eunuchs were mocked as incomplete men, yet they could wield the fate of an empire through their proximity to the throne. They were denied families of their own, yet they became fathers, brothers, and companions to the women trapped within the crimson walls. They were ridiculed by scholars and officials, yet relied upon by emperors who trusted no one else. In the quiet of the night, when the palace finally fell silent, eunuchs too carried their own sorrows. Some found solace in religion, chanting sutras under the dim light of oil lamps. Others sought comfort in friendships with fellow servants, forming bonds that replaced the families they had lost. Many buried their pain in loyalty to the palace, convincing themselves that in service they had found a purpose worth their sacrifice. The eunuch's world was one of shadows and whispers, power and vulnerability entwined. Just like the concubines, they were prisoners of the forbidden city, bound not by walls but by the choices and wounds that had forever shaped their lives. Stop. Shall I continue with Part 18, Rituals of Power, exploring the ceremonies and daily protocols that ruled every step of palace life, where even the smallest gesture could affirm or destroy a concubine's standing? Every palace was built on order, and within the forbidden city, order was maintained not merely by walls or guards, but by ritual. The concubines lived not as ordinary women, but as living participants in a theatre of hierarchy where each movement, each word, each bow was dictated by rules older than themselves. At dawn, the rituals began. Eunuchs knocked gently on chamber doors, waking concubines to prepare for the morning greetings. Hair was combed into elaborate shapes, robes selected according to rank, embroidered dragons for the empress, phoenixes for favoured consorts, simpler flowers for the lesser ranks. Every detail announced one's position within the living pyramid of power. When they walked into the Hall of Great Peace to greet the empress, the concubines arranged themselves with precise care. No one could step out of line, no one could stand where she did not belong. A single mistake could be read as arrogance, a subtle insult that might spark rivalries lasting years. Even the act of kneeling required perfection, the lowering of the body in smooth motion, the hands folded at just the right angle, the head bowed, neither too high nor too low. Meals, too, were governed by ritual. A favoured concubine might be invited to share a banquet with the emperor, her presence a visible sign of grace. Yet she would eat sparingly, for greed was unbecoming, and each dish placed before her had been carefully tested for poison. Wine was sipped slowly, always with an air of restraint. To laugh too freely, to speak out of turn, to show too much eagerness, all could undo what beauty and talent had built. Even in private ritual held sway. A concubine summoned to the emperor's chambers did not simply arrive. She underwent a process of cleansing. Her body was bathed, her hair perfumed, her garments inspected. Eunuchs carried her in a curtained chair through the courtyards, so that she arrived untouched by dust or the gaze of others. To be chosen was an honor, but also a burden. The emperor's interest was fleeting, and once withdrawn, the concubine returned to her chambers, knowing she might never be summoned again. Beyond the emperor's favor, rituals of power governed the women's relationships with each other. When a higher-ranked consort entered the room, lesser concubines were required to bow. The empress was greeted with the deepest obeisance, her title spoken in tones of reverence. These gestures reinforced hierarchy as surely as any edict binding women to the invisible chains of rank. Over time, ritual became second nature. A concubine could kneel gracefully even in her sleep, could smile in the exact measured way that pleased both her superiors and her rivals. Yet beneath the polished surface each gesture concealed tension. Every bow was a survival strategy, every smile, a calculation, every word spoken in ritualized tones, a mask over deeper desires. Life in the Forbidden City was not merely lived, it was performed, and in that performance, every concubine played her part in a drama where the stakes were nothing less than her future, her security, and her name in history. Above all, the women of the palace stood the Empress. She was the mother of the realm, the one whose presence embodied order within the Forbidden City. To outsiders, her role seemed enviable: robes of silk heavy with gold thread, a crown of phoenixes glittering with pearls, attendants waiting on her every need. But within those walls the Empress carried not just privilege but an unrelenting weight of duty and danger. Her mornings began earlier than the rest. Before the concubines rose to pay their respects, the Empress was already at her altar, offering incense to ancestors and heaven. Her position was not only domestic but sacred, the bridge between the imperial family and the gods who watched over the empire. With each bow she performed, she reaffirmed her legitimacy, reminding herself and others that her authority came not just from the emperor's favor but from tradition itself. When the concubines arrived to greet her, the Empress became the arbiter of discipline. A smile from her could secure peace. A sharp glance could remind a rival of her place. It was her responsibility to ensure harmony among the women, yet harmony was an illusion at best. Behind every bow lay hidden envy, and behind every compliment lurked suspicion. The Empress knew this, and so she lived as much in watchfulness as in ceremony. But her greatest burden was the emperor himself. Though she was his wife in name, his heart might belong elsewhere. The Empress had to accept this without protest, for jealousy in her position was dangerous. A single outburst, a hint of resentment could be twisted into a charge of disloyalty. Instead, she was expected to embody patience, dignity, and restraint. Her role was to protect the throne's stability, even if it meant swallowing her own pain. Yet power still lay in her hands. She supervised the vast network of eunuchs and servants, ensuring the palace ran without chaos. She oversaw the selection of concubines, the upbringing of imperial children, and the rituals that defined the court. She could reward or punish, raise a woman to prominence, or consign her to oblivion. For the emperor, often too occupied with politics or distracted by pleasures, the Empress was the true governor of the inner court. But every empress lived with the shadow of peril. Should she fail to produce an heir, her authority could falter. Should a favored concubine give birth to a strong son, whispers might grow that heaven favored another woman more. In some dynasties, rival factions of officials even used the Empress's position as a weapon, aligning with consorts to undermine her power. History remembers empresses who fell from grace, stripped of title, imprisoned in lonely halls until death. And yet, for all its perils, the role of Empress carried a kind of immortality. Long after lesser concubines were forgotten, the Empress's name endured in records in ancestral temples, in the carved stones of history. She bore not only the burden of her own survival, but the weight of dynasty itself. Her life was a crown of gold that gleamed brightly and cut deeply. For most concubines, beauty was only the beginning of their power. What truly changed a woman's fate inside the Forbidden City was the birth of a son. To bear the emperor's child, and especially a boy, transformed a concubine from ornament to political figure. Overnight, her chambers filled with attendants, gifts flowed in from grateful eunuchs and ministers eager to align with her, and her voice carried new weight in the hushed corridors of the palace. Motherhood in the Forbidden City, however, was never a private affair. Every pregnancy was monitored by the Empress herself, who oversaw the process with both authority and suspicion. Midwives were chosen carefully, food was tested daily, and even the air of the concubines' chambers seemed heavy with tension. For to carry an imperial heir was not merely to nurture a child, but to safeguard the dynasty. The slightest misstep, a miscarriage, an illness, a rumor, could topple her from favor and stain her name forever. If the child was born healthy, the mother's star rose. She might be granted a new title, her robes upgraded with richer embroidery, her apartments expanded. She would sit closer to the empress during rituals, her words weighed more carefully by rivals. Ministers at court might whisper her name, speculating whether her son could one day inherit the dragon throne. To be the mother of a prince was to step into a dangerous kind of glory. But with glory came peril. Sons were the beating heart of succession, and succession was a battlefield. Rival concubines might send spies disguised as maids to observe the child's health. Eunuchs loyal to other factions might spread whispers about a boy's frailty or question the legitimacy of his birth. Poison, always the silent weapon of the palace, lingered as a constant threat. The mother of a prince had to guard her child as though guarding her very soul, for his survival meant her survival. Nor was the boy's future secure even if he lived. The emperor might favor one son over another, or the ministers might divide into factions supporting different heirs. A single illness could strip away all her security. Some mothers who rose to prominence as bearers of princes spent their final years watching their sons exiled, imprisoned, or even executed in struggles for the throne. Their own lives often ended in quiet despair, victims of the very ambitions that once raised them up. And yet, for all the risks, this was the dream every concubine carried in silence. To bear a son was to carve one's name into history, to ensure that even if she faded from the emperor's memory, she lived on as the honored mother of a prince. Some succeeded and became empress dowagers, ruling from behind the curtain with unshakable authority. Others saw their children die young, their power crumble, and their names erased from the chronicles. Within the Forbidden City, motherhood was never tender, never safe. It was a weapon, a shield, a gamble played against fate. A concubine who bore a son held in her arms not just a child but the fragile future of an empire. Stop. Shall I continue with Part 21, The Invisible Enemies, where we explore the quiet but deadly struggles of poisonings, rumors, and betrayals that haunted every concubine's life in the palace. Life in the Forbidden City was a performance of grace, ritual, and obedience, but beneath its polished surface lay a constant undercurrent of dread. The greatest threats to a concubine were rarely seen, rarely spoken of, aloud, yet always present. These invisible enemies, rumors whispered behind silk sleeves, powders slipped into bowls of rice, glances exchanged in candlelight, were the true weapons of the inner court. Poison was the most feared of all. Kitchens bustled with eunuchs and maids. Each dish inspected each cup, tasted, yet suspicion lingered. Food was never simply eaten. It was tested, observed, and sometimes rejected entirely. A sip of tea, too bitter a meal, followed by sudden illness, a miscarriage with no clear cause, these were signs that a woman had been targeted. Eunuchs tasked with guarding the emperor's meals were executed if the smallest suspicion arose, but concubines were not always afforded such protection. Many learned to live half-starved, trusting only dishes prepared by a single maid, or refusing anything they had not watched with their own eyes. Rumors too could be poison, but of a slower kind. A single whisper that a concubine spoke ill of the empress, that she dabbled in forbidden charms, that her child was not the emperor's, could unravel her position faster than illness ever could. Once the words reached the wrong ears, they spread through the palace like wildfire. By the time the accused was summoned to defend herself, the truth mattered little. Perception had already condemned her. Sometimes the invisible enemy was not a rival but the palace itself. The air was damp in summer, freezing in winter, and filled with smoke from incense and candles. Disease crept through hidden corners carried by rats and insects, and small fevers could become death sentences in an age without modern medicine. A concubine who fell sick was quickly forgotten, her absence from the emperor's side explained away as bad fortune, and her chambers reassigned without a second thought. Even allies could not be trusted. A maid who seemed loyal might be bribed by another faction, turning her mistress's secrets into weapons. A eunuch who offered protection might in fact be serving two masters, shifting his loyalties with the wind. Every concubine lived surrounded by attendants, yet loneliness defined her existence, for to trust too deeply was to court betrayal. And so the women of the palace developed a second sight, an instinct for danger. They learned to read a glance, to detect malice in a tone, to sense when silence in a corridor meant someone was listening. Their survival depended not only on beauty or favor but on vigilance. Invisible enemies could not be fought with swords or soldiers. They could only be endured, outlasted, and if fortune allowed, outwitted. For those who failed, the end came quietly. A name struck from the records, a body carried away before dawn, an apartment sealed as if it had never been lived in. In the Forbidden City, memory itself could be poisoned until a concubine's existence was as invisible as the forces that had destroyed her. For much of the year, the palace existed in a rhythm of quiet routines, audiences, meals, prayers, embroidery, waiting. But then came the festivals, those rare moments when the stillness of the Forbidden City erupted into color, sound, and ceremony. For concubines, these occasions were both a reprieve from monotony and a stage upon which their fortunes could subtly shift. The most splendid was the New Year. Lanterns hung in long rows, their light casting a warm glow on frozen courtyards. Musicians filled the halls with the sound of drums and flutes, while acrobats and dancers performed before the dragon throne. For the emperor, it was a time to display the glory of his dynasty. For the concubines, it was a time to be seen. Each woman dressed in her finest silks, layered in colors chosen not only for beauty but for symbolism, crimson for joy, jade green for renewal, gold for prosperity. To be noticed during such an event was to be remembered long after the lanterns dimmed. The Mid-Autumn Festival carried a gentler charm. Mooncakes were arranged on lacquered trays, their patterns pressed with symbols of harmony and longevity. Candles flickered in the cool night, casting shadows across the carved eaves of the palace roofs. Concubines gathered in small groups, their voices hushed, their eyes drawn to the luminous disk of the moon. Some whispered poems, others sang songs from their native provinces, carrying memories of families they had not seen in years. For a moment, under that same moon that shone on every village and river beyond the red walls, they felt connected to the world outside. The Festival of Lanterns transformed the Forbidden City into a dreamscape. Corridors blazed with light, the gardens shimmered with floating candles, and painted lanterns drifted on ponds like stars fallen to earth. Here, too, the concubines appeared in procession, their faces pale under the glow, their eyes watchful. Even the smallest smile offered at the right moment could catch the emperor's attention and bring months of new favor. Every gesture was a performance rehearsed carefully for these rare nights when the court became theatre. And yet festivals also deepened the sense of isolation. While the world beyond the walls celebrated freely, the women of the palace lived their joy under constant watch. Every dance was choreographed, every toast measured, every glance weighed. If a concubine laughed too loudly, it was noticed. If she appeared withdrawn, it was whispered about. To others, the festivals were a release. To them, it was another test. Still within the shadows of the grand rituals, moments of quiet humanity bloomed. A concubine might catch the sound of children playing with sparklers or hear the faint notes of a familiar song that stirred memories of her youth. She might see her reflection in the lantern-lit ponds and, for a heartbeat, remember who she had been before the palace claimed her. For all their splendor, the festivals of the Forbidden City were not simply celebrations. They were mirrors reflecting both the majesty of the empire and the hidden longings of the women who lived at its heart. To live within the Forbidden City was not only to exist in gilded chambers and to wear silk robes, it was to learn the art of survival day by day, breath by breath. For a concubine, survival was not measured in years, but in moments, moments of speech, silence, posture, and glance. The smallest choice might safeguard her place or undo her entirely. The first art was silence. Words in the palace were blades sharper than any soldier's sword. A careless complaint about the cold, a sigh at the unfairness of rank, even a murmur of nostalgia for family could be overheard, repeated, reshaped into treachery. Concubines learned to weigh every syllable. They spoke in half-phrases, in delicate hints, in tones so neutral that they seemed to carry no meaning at all. And yet those who mastered silence also mastered suggestion. With a glance or a pause, they could say more than words ever could. The second art was adaptability. Each emperor had his preferences, one adored poetry, another music, another the taste of rare dishes. A woman who thrived was one who adjusted herself like water poured into a vessel, reshaping to whatever form was required. If the emperor enjoyed calligraphy, she learned the brush. If he loved the hunt, she studied falcons and horses. Even the tone of laughter could be tuned to suit him. In this way, concubines became artists of the self-crafting and recrafting identities in the hope of survival. The third art was invisibility. To be too noticeable was dangerous. To be forgotten was equally so. The trick was to dwell in the middle ground, always present, never threatening. A concubine might step lightly, bow gracefully, and let her beauty speak without seeming to flaunt it. She might offer advice only when asked, fading into the background when rivalries turned fierce. Invisibility was not absence, but the careful concealment of presence, the art of letting others fight while one remained untouched. The fourth art was ritual. Concubines guarded themselves with small private routines, prayers whispered before dawn, talismans hidden in sleeves, combs placed a certain way on the vanity. These rituals gave rhythm to lives otherwise dictated by imperial decree. They were fragments of control, reminders that not all of life was decided by fate. And finally, the greatest art of survival was patience. In a world where fortunes shifted with the emperor's gaze, where allies became enemies overnight, patience was a weapon stronger than ambition. A concubine might wait years without being summoned, enduring whispers of failure before one chance encounter restored her favor. Another might resist the urge to strike at a rival too soon, letting her enemy fall to her own missteps. To endure in silence, to wait without bitterness, was a skill more valuable than beauty or wit. These arts did not guarantee happiness, but they gave life shape. They allowed concubines to carve small spaces of stability in a world designed to keep them off balance. Survival in the Forbidden City was not won by strength of arms, but by the strength of will, the quiet, unyielding refusal to be erased. In the beginning, the palace was a place of anticipation. Young women entered with bright eyes, their hair thick and dark, their futures seemingly limitless. But time within the Forbidden City was merciless. For a concubine, the end of the road came not with scandal or dismissal, but with the slow fading of beauty and the steady march of age. A woman who had once been radiant enough to catch the emperor's gaze might one day see her reflection in the polished bronze mirror and hardly recognize herself. Lines etched across her forehead, strands of silver threaded through black hair, the light dimmed in her eyes. Youth, the currency of her worth, slipped away with each passing season, and as it faded, so too did her place in the palace. Some concubines found themselves moved to the quieter quarters of the palace, far from the emperor's chambers. Their nights were no longer spent in expectation of a summons, but in long hours of silence. They embroidered less, prayed more, and watched the younger women move through the corridors as they themselves once had. To fade into obscurity was perhaps the gentlest ending, though it was filled with a deep loneliness. Others were transferred to the palace of compassion and tranquility, where widowed empresses and older women spent their final years. There life was calmer, removed from the rivalries of youth. The women gathered in gardens, shared stories, and performed rituals together, waiting for the inevitable. It was not freedom, but it was peace of a kind. The most fortunate concubines were those who bore imperial sons. Even if the emperor's love waned, the power of motherhood remained. To be the mother of a prince was to hold significance long after beauty was gone. Such women could live out their years with honor, often addressed with respect by the younger generation, their legacy tied to the bloodline of emperors. But for those who had no children, no strong allies, and no lasting favor, the end was bleaker. They might spend decades tucked away in forgotten courtyards, nameless even to the eunuchs who brought them food. Their lives narrowed to the size of their chambers, their voices unheard, their deaths marked only by a simple record in the archives. And yet even in such endings, resilience could be found. Some concubines became storytellers, passing down memories of emperors, long dead, of festivals long past, of rivalries that once shook the palace, but were now only echoes. In sharing their stories, they preserved themselves against the erasure of time. For the women of the Forbidden City, the end of the road was not a single moment but a gradual dimming like the last light of a lantern at dawn. Some faded quietly, others left traces of influence, but all shared the same truth. Once the red gates closed behind them, their lives were sealed to this place, and here they would remain until the end. The Forbidden City has long since ceased to be a palace of emperors. Its vast courtyards echo now, with the footsteps of tourists, its chambers preserved as relics of an age gone by. Yet as you walk through its red lacquered gates and gaze at its gilded halls, you cannot help but sense the faint presence of those who once lived and died within these walls. The concubines of the palace, women both celebrated and forgotten, are still here, if not in flesh, then in memory. Their names are rarely spoken in history books. Records often mention them only as numbers in the hierarchy, titles rather than individuals. But behind each title was a life, a girl who left her village, a woman who sang for the emperor, a mother who worried for her son, an elder who faded into silence. These lives, though written lightly in ink, were heavy in reality. Some concubines left behind legacies through their children who became princes and emperors, shaping dynasties. Others left behind poetry, embroidery, or small traces of art that slipped into the culture of their time. But the majority left nothing tangible, only the quiet testimony of survival. Their legacy is the endurance of women who lived in the shadow of absolute power, who navigated danger and beauty, favor and fear, all within the confines of one city. Even today, when visitors walk past the Hall of Supreme Harmony, or pause in the smaller courtyards where concubines once lived, they may sense a kind of whisper. It is not the whisper of ghosts, but of history itself, reminding us that behind the grandeur of emperors were countless women whose lives were both ordinary and extraordinary. They were mothers, rivals, lovers, dreamers. They laughed and wept, they schemed and prayed, they endured and faded. The Forbidden City is remembered for its dragons and thrones, its symbols of imperial might. Yet in its quietest corners it carries the softer hidden legacy of women who were never meant to be remembered, but who in their silence became eternal. Their memory lingers not in triumph but in resilience, in the quiet endurance that is perhaps the greatest form of strength. And so when we speak of the Forbidden City, we must not think only of emperors and ministers. We must also remember the concubines, their beauty and sorrow, their hope and resignation, their fleeting moments of joy and their long seasons of waiting. For in remembering them we give voice to those who once lived unseen, and we keep alive the truth that history is not only the story of kings but of those who dwelled in their shadow. The story ends here, but their presence does not. It lingers like the echo of footsteps on stone, like the trace of incense in the air. The concubines of the Forbidden City remain not as forgotten figures but as part of the living memory of a world both beautiful and cruel.